There was a question there. Thank you, Turkan. So, thank you, Turkan. Today is the World Social Work Day. Well, happy World Social Worker Day to all social workers joining us today. Okay, so we are 93 attendees. Hopefully we'll have more people joining us. But let's start. My name is Yasmina Bayraktarevic-Haywood, and I'm the president of the Refugee Council of Australia. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land that I find myself on, the Cabrogal people of the Darug Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to all First Nations people in the audience today. I would also like all of you to acknowledge the country that you find yourself in within your heart. This webinar is the first one of our new format. Many of you might have attended our Refugee Alternatives conference, and the previous format was actually an annual 2-day conference. And we looked at alternatives to refugee policy, practice, and public support. The new format will have the same focus and will remain virtual because our virtual conference was quite a success. This particular webinar will explore global refugee protection needs in 2022, and we'll look at mass displacement in Africa, including Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Ukraine. Our panel includes experts with lived experience, and they will explore the situation for people on the ground. We'll also discuss the international diplomacy that's underway, the connection to Australia, what Australia can do to support people affected by these conflicts and the mass displacement. We'll offer you the latest information we have and invite you with a call for action, because there are things that we can do. Today's speakers panel includes the former Australian Human Rights Commissioner, Sidorti, Rohingya refugee activist and the chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, Hafsah Tomasudin, Refugee Council of Australia Special Advisor, Ahmad Jamal, and last but not least, the Deputy CEO of the Refugee Council, Adama Kamara. In terms of housekeeping, we are on webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll make the recording available to all who have registered. It might take us a day or two to do that. You'll receive an email. You can use the Q&A feature in Zoom if you need assistance from our team, like I said, or if you would like to ask any questions, we'll attempt to answer as many questions as possible. Please tag us on social media. You're using any social media you're using, the hashtag is #AltRefugee. Before we move on to the speakers, I'd just like to acknowledge the current situation in Ukraine and give you some information. We have approached a number of Ukrainian organizations and networks to see how we can support them and see if they're able to join today's webinar. I was informed they were not able to join because of immense voluntary work they're involved in at the moment. We'd just like to share some current information as we have it. United Nations estimates that there is 2.5 million refugees that have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries, largely Poland. There is at least 1.85 million internally displaced people, an additional 12.65 million people directly affected by the conflict. But they're also contending with freezing temperatures. And as you know, majority of the people escaping are women, children, and elderly, and it does raise concerns about human trafficking. But there's an urgent need for food, water, medical supplies, and medication, shelter, and basic provisions like blankets, mattresses, fuel. Australian government has announced 70 million in military assistance, $35 million in humanitarian aid, and a raft of sanctions against military and banking and business entities from Russia, including security, personnel, commanders, and others. Department of Home Affairs has advised that they've prioritized outstanding visa applications for people from Ukraine. That's approximately 430 people. And there will be an automatic visa extension for 6 months for those who are Ukrainian and whose visa expires before the end of this financial year. In terms of our refugee program, it is not clear yet what will happen. On the 27th of February, the Prime Minister suggested that we might take more people, and there might be in addition to our normal humanitarian program. However, we haven't heard back. Given the fact that visas offered to those from Afghanistan were actually fewer than we were all hoping for, and they were not additional to the program, it isn't clear what the government will do for refugees fleeing Ukraine and other crises. So with that update, we'll move on to our first panelist. And our first panelist is Hafsah Tomasudin, who is a former Rohingya refugee based in New Zealand currently. She has been an advocate for the rights of refugees and stateless people and gender equality for more than a decade. While she was in Malaysia as a refugee, she worked with Rohingya and other refugee organizations from Myanmar in responding and preventing sexual and gender-based violence, including child marriages. Hafsah is a steering committee member of APNO and New Zealand country coordinator of Free Rohingya Coalition, as well as the acting chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network. She also consults and works with grassroots Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Myanmar. She will now provide us with an update on the situation.
Thank you. I'm just trying to share my screen. Thank you very much. I'm just going to give a bit of overview information around what's happening since after 2021 February coup. As you can see here on the slideshow, it is showing about the number of people who has died until this point. At least, as you can see on the slide here, at least 440 houses and building has been sealed off by the junta since 2021. And a total of 9,625 people are currently under detention, and 1,672 people are now confirmed killed by junta this coup. And 842 people have been sentenced in person. Of them, 45 have been sentenced to death, including 2 children. And 180 people have been sentenced in absentia, of 39 sentenced to death in absentia. So that is the data that I have received from one of the websites until this point, what is happening. And in addition to the things that I've shared from the slideshow that I've mentioned, and also things I mentioned on website, there are many other civilians who have been affected by the coup. That includes Rohingya and other ethnic minority groups of Myanmar who are at risk, have been escaping to the border of Thailand, India, and other neighboring countries. And from the source of information through my network, and there are many individuals who are active in response to the coup, people who involved in PDF People Defense Force or supporting NUG National Unity Government, and their family members of individuals are hiding in safe houses in Thailand and other locations. They are constantly at risk of being detained, arrested in Thailand. And if they got detained, they are also constantly at risk of being tortured and killed if they were deported back to Myanmar. That includes my own family hiding in Thailand. The asylum seeking process for these cases are not known to many others who are hiding in Thailand at the moment, according to the information sources that I have received. There are not enough humanitarian responses or protection for the people who are in this situation. Many of them are afraid even to go out of their hiding places, and they struggle for their day-to-day survival. That includes having enough support for food, shelter, and other medical needs. And for the people who are hiding in India, I don't have so much detailed information of the people in India. However, from my friends and again, network in the advocacy spaces, and I have received information that there are not adequate support for humanitarian response to these people again. No immediate protection from euthanasia. They are at risk of being arrested and detained or deported back if they were found by the authority of India. And the other thing that I would like to touch base very quickly is about the COVID situation in Myanmar. Since the coup has started, it become very challenging for the civilians to get access to medical support or any medication if people get COVID. So people are also dying from that. And also there are economic crises in the country because people are afraid to go out and things are not going as usual. That is the general situation of Myanmar. Sorry, I was on the wrong slide. So this is Going back to the situation of Rohingya at the moment. So under the coup situation, it has become quite difficult to continue to draw attention for Rohingyas. And the Rohingya situation is now sort of generalized under the bigger issues on plate. So right now, again, based on the information that I have received from my advocacy network, the Rohingya situation in Myanmar, inside Myanmar, they are vulnerable to extortion and abuse daily by the authority and other armed groups. And a month ago, there have been a couple of incidents where Rohingya youths and Rohingya villagers were being used as the human shield during the fight between armed groups, Arakan army and military in Rakhine State. Because of those vulnerable situations in the country, Rohingya continue to take the risky journey of fleeing by boat or other means of trafficking to or smuggling to neighboring countries. That includes Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand again. So in those situations, Rohingyas are vulnerable on the journey, during the journey, after they arrive to the country itself. On 6th of March, 114 Rohingyas have arrived to Aceh, Indonesia. I'm not still sure that if they have got any type of protection at all, whether through from UNHCR, other organization or agency at the moment, they are still in limbo. So the Rohingya situation now in the camp, there is no adequate humanitarian support for them to have dignified human life and decent human life, no access to education. And also they continue to suffer from extortion, disaster, and the security threat for the activists. And I'm sure you all are aware of the Rohingya activists being murdered in the refugee camp, followed by a couple of incidents in Bangladesh. Repatriation, there is no resettlement at all for Rohingyas from Bangladesh camp. And there are some particular countries who do not take Rohingya refugees at all under resettlement program. Repatriation for the Rohingyas right now seems to be a long way to go. Also to ensure safe repatriation under the coup. Also, whenever we speak about repatriation, we are also reflecting the repatriation experience that the Rohingya had in 1991, how it was unsuccessful, and then how there was no accountability for their safety after repatriation in 1991. And again, if we are thinking about repatriation at this point, who will be accountable for their safety? That will be another question to think about. So also, I forgot to mention another disaster that Rohingya seems to experience in the camp is the fire. So there were recent fire incidents in the camp with a couple of weeks ago, and also the latest one is on 8th of March. So that leaves 554 shelters were burned down, and also the school, and then people are in immediate emergency needs of clothes, food, and shelter. So whenever we think about Rohingya situation, I would like to urge us again to consider the history of deprivation and persecution Rohingyas have been experiencing, and still having the impacts of it due to statelessness, etc. And even though we have other bigger things on place, we need to consider all the deprivation that they have in the country, in the refugee camp, in host country, even their pathway to resettlement being very limited. And after in 2017 genocide incident, we all are aware that there are many thousand Rohingyas who escaped to Bangladesh and still in limbo, 1 million plus. And in host country, there are Rohingyas who have been there for more than 2 decades. We now have second generation of Rohingyas in host country and in refugee camps without having resettlement channels or pathway for them. So the solution right now, from my perspective, what do we do now? As I think is to continue to engage and explore ways about possibility to provide humanitarian support and protection to the people who are escaping from Myanmar and who are still in limbo, including Rohingyas. And also not to fail to remember the long-term suffering and exclusion of Rohingyas and their vulnerability due to statelessness and history of ongoing abuse and persecution against more than 6 decades ago until now. and to also explore ways to ensure the better livelihood of Rohingyas and others from Myanmar in hiding places, refugee camps, and in host country. Resettlement, exploring options for resettlement to more countries under different humanitarian criteria through responsibility sharing and meaningful participation of refugees and people with lived experience. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And also the role of, when we speak about the role of NGOs and states, and I think it is very important to consider to provide fair and equal humanitarian attention and support to all refugees who are equally vulnerable. It is very important for us to provide our immediate humanitarian and diplomatic support to any ongoing or arising humanitarian crisis in the region, but it is also crucial not to forget the existing and ongoing refugee and humanitarian crisis in the refugee camps, host country, and in their country of origin. Just because some particular refugee groups have been in that situation for decades, it doesn't normalize their life, or it doesn't normalize their situation. I mean, what does normalization even means for them? It doesn't make their lives easier. They continue to struggle every single day just to make it through another day. So please let us not forget that and continue to engage, consult, and explore ways to respond to this humanitarian crisis through responsibility sharing and meaningful participation of refugees and people with lived experiences. And it is very, very great to see that now, if there is any arising humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis, it seems to be better than in the past in responding that. There are some special programs. We're thinking about, okay, we are having 3,000 and 4,000 refugees from this particular country under this scheme to the particular country. So if that can happen for one group of vulnerable refugee groups, and we need to think about why can't we do that for other refugees? And also, how do we justify which groups are more vulnerable than the other groups? And I'm sure we have the ability to think it through and to make it possible to provide fair and equal humanitarian support to all refugees who are equally vulnerable. It all seems to be very impossible when we think of doing it alone. And I also think it is unfair to say it is the responsibility of one INGO or one NGO or a particular individual. It is our shared responsibility. If we do it together, I think it is possible and we can find ways. And I would like to end my presentation just to say, saying this quote by Helen Keller. It's saying, alone we can do so little. Together we can do so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafsah. And thank you for bringing attention to this important issue where many communities feel that as media cycle moves from one conflict to the next, communities feel they have been forgotten. So our next panelist is Adama Kamara. Adama is the Deputy CEO of the Refugee Council of Australia. Adama has actually 15 years experience in refugee services in health and local government, as well as personal and family experience of seeking asylum and supporting people from her own home country of Sierra Leone. Adama has a passion for community-led initiatives, and he's an advocate, strong advocate for meaningful participation. She has led co-design projects with young people, people seeking asylum, refugees, and people culturally and linguistically diverse communities and service providers. Welcome, Adama, and over to you.
Thank you, Yasmina. So I'll be speaking about the displacement occurring in the African region, so the countries of Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. Each of those countries we could spend hours talking about, but what I'll be doing is just some key points from each of those countries so we can get an overview of the conflict, of the situation on the ground. It's important, I guess, to acknowledge that there are multiple conflicts in other parts of Africa, and there is mass displacement ongoing with this ongoing conflict, this political instability, and multiple protracted refugee situations that contribute to new and ongoing displacement on the continent. So when I say protracted, I'm referring to long-lasting state of limbo. So individuals may not be at risk, but their life may not be at risk, but their basic rights and essential needs, such as an income source, education, access to training, clean water, food, social and psychological needs are not being fulfilled. there is ongoing dependence on external sources for their livelihood. There's also restrictions on refugee movements, such as only being allowed to live in a particular area of a country or in a particular town, such as refugee camps, and not being allowed to be employed outside of that area. These are all part of protracted refugee situations. There are practical implications for restrictions on movement. So, for example, education. There's the implications on the quality and the level of education a person can receive. It limits the employment options as well as income opportunities, and it just perpetuates a cycle of poverty. So I guess more durable solutions are needed, and we need to move towards more self-reliance with physical, legal, and economic security. Resettlement in a third country, such as Australia, is a viable option due to the large humanitarian need in the region and the multiple conflicts and links to Australia as well. As we know, people from the DRC, Ethiopia, and South Sudan have been resettled in Australia. Whilst the numbers have reduced, the demand and need still remains high. For 2020, the UNHCR says that the resettlement needs in the continent of Africa represent 40% of the total global resettlement needs in the world. So this 40% is actually from 33 countries, so countries such as Congo, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and countries in the Sahel region. So DRC and South Sudan have the second and third highest resettlement needs globally, as identified by UNHCR. So that's approximately 10% and 9% of the estimated population. I guess with such mass displacement in the region, as I mentioned before, we do need durable solutions. Voluntary repatriation is being encouraged. However, with conflict in multiple parts of the continent, it's not always a viable option. There are attempts for local integration in host countries, but what we know is that more diplomatic work is needed so that host governments are able to extend citizenship and rights to people who are seeking asylum in their country. So resettlement is a key critical protection tool and a durable solution. So I'll start off by talking about South Sudan. South Sudan is, I guess, the youngest country in Africa, gained independence in 2011 after over 20 years of conflict. There's approximately, and the numbers are, depending on which source, the numbers fluctuate, but there's approximately 4 million refugees hosted in neighboring countries such as Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya. There's been multiple conflicts pre-independence and also post-independence for about 7 or 8 years. And there was a peace agreement in 2018, which formed a unity government. And this peace agreement was supposed to end the conflict and bring stability. However, the conflict continues in parts of the country, and there's violence between communities as this competition for land and resource grows. There's also delays in implementing the peace agreement. What we know also on the ground is that questioning authorities comes at a cost. Protesters have been arrested. There's a media and press, if they're questioning the government, they're detained, attacked, or forced into self-censorship. Social media is actually being used in creative ways, especially by young people, to raise awareness about what's happening within the country. But we do know traditional media still needs to be allowed to operate without any restriction. The ongoing conflict has meant that there's also been little investment in infrastructure, such as education and healthcare. And during the height of the pandemic, there were about 5 million children who were out of school, could not attend school because the infrastructure wasn't there to support homeschooling. And as mentioned before, that people from South Sudan have actually fled and sought asylum in neighbouring countries. But life in those countries is quite challenging. There's limited work rights and people working in the cash economy, low quality public education. And for those who can't afford to pay for private education, they're subject to the public education that is available. There is political instability in certain parts of, in some of those countries they are seeking asylum in, and also in their and because there's instability within the country, certain parts of the country, it's returning home may not be possible. I guess in terms of the community here in Australia, the exact numbers of arrivals are difficult to determine just due to the data, because South Sudan gained independence in 2011. So people might have come to Australia as a country of birth listed as Sudan. But what we know is that the community estimates there's approximately 20,000 people of South Sudanese heritage living in Australia. So there are strong links to Australia. There's a strong humanitarian need, and there's, I guess, also a strong need for family reunion as people are separated from their family members. So the need for Australia to respond is there, humanitarian need, strong links through family reunion as well. Again, so I'll move on to Democratic Republic of Congo. I know that there's more I could say about each of the conflicts, but as a matter of time, I'll be brief. Democratic Republic of Congo, I guess conflicts have been going on for over 24 years. And it's, again, people have fled into neighboring countries such as Angola, Burundi, Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, Malawi, and Zambia. And countries like Uganda are actually hosting refugees from multiple conflicts. So South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and so on. There's conflict continues in the eastern part of the country, and security remains unstable. So as people are fleeing from newer conflicts, they're actually joining people who are in protracted situations. So you've got, and those people have been in protracted situations perhaps since the beginning of the current conflict 24 years ago. So you've got protracted refugee situations and then newer conflicts to add on top of that. There is voluntary repatriation occurring, but that's quite limited. And again, for those who have sought asylum in secondary or third countries, there's restrictions on their movement, right to work, housing, limitations on property ownership, and access to education. In speaking to community members recently, there was examples of where the host communities actually there's backlash against refugees in the host communities. So, for example, in November 2021, the Malawi government gave a 14-day deadline for refugees to return back to the Zaleka camp. And this camp was created to host refugees from Rwanda, Burundi, and DRC. And the intention was to host 14,000 people. There's 48,000 people living in that camp. And what it meant that people who were not living within the camp, living in urban areas, who had sought asylum in Malawi, had businesses, were educated, had studied, were forced to return back to the camp and lose their livelihood. So you can see there's a growing sentiment against refugees by the host community. Again, in some other parts of the continent, they're being forced only to stay within the camps. Within Australia, there is a community from DRC within Australia. The numbers have reduced over the years that have been resettled, but again, ongoing conflicts demonstrate there is a humanitarian need. It's a protracted refugee situation and people have been in there for decades. And there is humanitarian need. There's also links to Australia, family reunion being one of the most obvious needs for people to be resettled in Australia. So again, the community has said that looking for ways on how the number can be increased, number of people from DRC resettled through the humanitarian program can be increased. And the humanitarian program as well, the community sponsorship program has been cited as a way for Australia to do that, particularly for those in protracted refugee situations. Now, in terms of Ethiopia, Ethiopia is the second most populated country in Africa with over 114 million people. It's estimated there's about 9 million people that have been affected by the current conflict in the northern part of the country, the Tigray region, with conflict breaking out in November 2020. So in the first 3 months of this conflict, the estimated 70,000 people fled to neighboring countries such as Sudan, Djibouti, Kenya, and Uganda. And in terms of this particular conflict, is characterized by drought and food insecurity. What we know also is that there's aid access is limited. There's difficulties getting aid into the conflict region, one, because there's conflict, but there's also accusations that access is being deliberately blocked. And that is alarming, knowing that the humanitarian need is increasing. As people are fleeing, refugee camps are being created, but the demand is faster than the sites can be set up. And we know people are sleeping without any shelter, have limited access to food and medical supplies. And we've also heard talks of calls of people who have fled to countries such as Djibouti being forcibly repatriated back to the country. Another thing about the situation in Ethiopia is also there's a media and communications blockout from that Tigray region. We've heard from people in Australia who are actually separated from their family members. They can't call, email, or use any social media or have any contact with people in that particular region, and unsure of what's actually happening to their family members, if they're okay, have they fled. And I think the contact can be quite, the lack of contact is just adding to the stress of the people in the diaspora. Again, as similar with the other conflicts, the humanitarian need is great. The conflict is ongoing, and the region has a number of conflicts happening. So there is a great need for humanitarian aid, but also there are existing links within Australia. So things like family reunion or refugee humanitarian, an increase in refugee humanitarian program will enable, is one of the viable solutions to addressing the need there. Okay, I think I'm running out of time. So I guess in summary, I think in terms of those 3 countries in Africa, there is an ongoing humanitarian need. An increased intake for the refugee humanitarian program would enable Australia to respond to the crisis, would also allow for family reunion for separated family members, and programs like the Community Refugee Sponsorship Program will enable Australia to respond to people in protracted refugee situations. Okay.
Thank you, Adama, for such a comprehensive overview in such a short time of a very complex situation or a number of situations across Africa. We'll be able to ask Adama questions after we finish with all the speakers. So our next speaker is Ahmad Jamal, who is a researcher and former Afghan civil servant and now in exile. Most recently, Shuja has served as the Director General for International Relations and Regional Cooperation at the Afghan National Security Council, where he helped manage Afghanistan security partnerships. He also served as the Director for Peace and Civilian Protection and handled Afghanistan's policy portfolio on international sanctions, including those of the UN Security Council and the US against Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. Prior to his civil service work, Shuja was a researcher for Human Rights Watch, and he served as the Director for Development in the American University of Afghanistan, helping to reopen the university after the devastating terrorist attack on campus in August 2016. Jamal has authored several publications, including for the US Institute of Peace and Human Rights Watch. He's also the co-author of a forthcoming book, The Decline and Fall of Republican Afghanistan. He's a Fulbright recipient and has a master's in public policy from Georgetown University. Luckily for us, Shuja has joined the Refugee Council of Australia team in December 2021 as our special advisor. He will now provide an update on the situation in Afghanistan. Over to you, Jamal.
Thank you very much, Yasmina, and also thank you to everybody who is present today on this webinar. I think seeing such robust numbers indicates how important refugee issues continue to remain in the Australian community. And I think we don't need any reminder as to how difficult it continues to be for millions of people around the world. And so thank you all for being here today. As you all remember, in August of 2021, the Taliban overthrew the former Afghan government, the Republic of Afghanistan, and that precipitated a mass displacement event in Afghanistan, not just internally, but also externally. But even as Afghans needed to flee the country, regional countries responded in 2 ways that would counter that wave. First, they paused, limited, or even stopped the issuance of visas to Afghans. And second, they tightened border controls by restricting cross-border movement, even if people had visas and other documents. And so the net effect of that was that depending on what point in time you were traveling, this made it difficult for many Afghans to use regular channels. But that obviously does not stop the use of alternative channels because you resort to desperate journeys if you cannot use safe pathways. But even if that is the case, we have some information about internal displacement numbers in Afghanistan, but worryingly, we have little specific data about the scale of cross-border movements by Afghans. UNHCR, which is usually the primary collector and provider of data at such large scales, has had its data collection efforts hampered and affected by recent events. For the two countries in the region, I will tell you what UNHCR data has been like. For Iran, for example, UNHCR actually relies on Iranian government data for arrivals of Afghans in 2021 and 2022. It also works currently on the, quote, assumption that there was 500,000 arrivals in 2021 alone, and also uses the other method of predicting or estimating the number of refugee arrivals by using what they call refugee focal points, who tell them that since the August of last year, the vast majority of recent arrivals to Iran are families, as opposed to single males arriving into Iran. UNHCR for Pakistan has also changed its methodology. They employ what they call a mixed methodology, which is primarily characterized by gathering data by using a, quote, network of key informants. Think of this as UNHCR reaching out to community elders in particular locations and getting their sense of inflows of refugees, families, and other people displaced from Afghanistan. So since 2021, there has been 117,547 Afghans who have gone into Pakistan. So between 500,000 that has gone into Iran, which is the, quote, assumption used by UNHCR, and the 117,000 that has gone into Pakistan, you begin to see the vast discrepancy between the two figures. And that is not because of any lack of effort that is it is difficult using the current data, even more difficult under the current circumstances than it has been in the past. This will likely be fixed over time as UNHCR seeks to increase its presence, its capacity, including on key border crossing points, which they can observe and document. But the difficulty is number one, that donors like Australia are already allocating Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran based on incomplete data. And the UN's Transitional Engagement Framework for 2022, which sets out the UN's spending priorities in Afghanistan for the year, suffers from data blind spots. And this will have real impact on their of resources. And the work of activist and advocacy community is difficult, but not as difficult as the first two categories, because even if we don't know if a certain displacement is, say, 90,000 or 80,000, that 10,000 makes relatively little appreciable difference in an advocacy campaign because we have a fairly good sense of the orders of magnitude. We're not missing it by thousands versus millions. We're missing it only by a smaller margin. So advocacy is affected, but I think this robust work is still possible. Now, one aspect of the displacement about Afghanistan that gets little attention is what might be called micro-displacement. And what I mean by that is that many people inside of Afghanistan who feel threatened by the Taliban's coming to power flee raids by the Taliban on their houses by leaving their homes or even their neighborhoods to essentially couch surf, if you will. That's a terrible way of saying that they go from safe house to safe house, from place to place, which exposes them to difficult conditions, affects the quality of life, their mental, obviously, health, and in itself could constitute a form of persecution by the Taliban. Now, there's no good data for how many people are in this situation, but there are thousands of people in multiple cities across the country who have nowhere else to go but to resort to this kind of thing, in particular because the Taliban have started recently intensifying their campaign of house-to-house searches in multiple cities, including Kabul, but also even in southern cities like Helmand. But other than that, the conflict-induced displacement of people leaving their homes and going to a different city permanently is estimated to have displaced about 710,000 Afghans since the January of last year in 2021. So as we think about these issues, I think it is very critical as we look for better data, as we encourage a coordinated approach by resettlement countries, it's important not to lose sight of the Taliban's agency in precipitating this disaster. That remains key to a durable solution to not just the micro displacement, the internal displacement, but also the cross-border displacement in Afghanistan. The Taliban are driving mass displacement in two ways. Number one, by virtue of them coming to power and conducting violent persecution. People are fleeing multiple active campaigns of persecution, in particular minorities such as the Hazaras, also the Tajiks, and including other people who are in the opposition to the Taliban. Women are also particularly affected by this. So number two is non-violent effects of the Taliban coming to power. This means that the economy is in a terrible condition. There are severe restrictions on education and women's public participation. There is a shrinkage of civic space. There are restrictions on the media. So people are not just leaving the country because their lives are in imminent and real danger. They're also leaving because even if they're not direct imminent targets of violent persecution, they feel like life under the Taliban is untenable for them. It's not the kind of country that they see themselves living in. Now, I was in the US when former President Trump was elected in the US. In the lead up to his election, a lot of Americans were telling me, well, if the US elects Trump, I am leaving this country. Which to me was a signal they were sending about their preferences for the politics of their country. Now, that is obviously an expression of preference about the outcome of a democratic exercise. But imagine how much untenable, unpalatable, and unacceptable the current situation in Afghanistan is, about which nothing is democratic and nothing is reversible. I have had people reach out to me saying, when the Taliban first came to power, we were not planning to leave the country. But now our stay in this country has become difficult. It has become untenable. So many people are only now seeking to leave the country. So the trends and the numbers will take time to crystallize, but I think worrying implications are already obvious. As Hafsah said in her comments, I think in the absence of safe and legal pathways and increasingly limited evacuation efforts run by countries like Australia, the US, and others, Afghans are making dangerous journeys abroad. And that exposes them to smugglers, human traffickers, massive unaccountable abuse by border guards of countries that do not want them transiting through their land, and obviously the abuses and the indignities that they suffer along the way as they use these routes to move forward. So I will stop there, but I think there are possible ways to address the situation, one of which is really to address the fundamental key driver of the displacement, not just through violent persecution, but also by making life untenable in Afghanistan, which is the nature and the extent of the current regime in the country, but also by responding in policy, refugee policy ways by refugee resettlement countries like Australia, the US, and others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shuja. It's again another excellent overview in a very short time we have given to you. Please keep in mind that you can continue posting your questions in the Q&A section. It was interesting to hear reflection on data and how the data is acquired, and interesting to hear the reflections on situation as it has developed in Afghanistan. And I'd like to add another group that's affected in Afghanistan, but also other countries of resettlement. It would be people with diverse sexualities, genders, and bodies, the LGBTIQ community. I have heard quite a lot of comments from people from Afghanistan in particular. Okay, so our next speaker is, last but not least again, Chris Sidorti. Chris is a human rights lawyer. He's an advocate and a teacher. He's a member of the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar. He has been a commissioner on UN human rights investigations, including on Myanmar and currently on Palestine and Israel. He has been Australian Human Rights Commissioner from 1995 to 2000 and Australian Law Reform Commissioner from 1992 to 1995. He has worked in non-government organizations, including the International Service for Human Rights in Geneva, Human Rights Council of Australia, and the Australian Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace. He's a member of the board of St. Francis Social Service. We'll hear from Chris on diplomacy options available to Australia. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Jasmina. And I too start by recognising the Indigenous owners of the land on which I'm sitting, and where most of you are also sitting and participating in this seminar. For me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects, acknowledging their elders, past and present, and particularly enheartened by the new leadership that is coming through that will take Indigenous Australians into the future. We have heard much sobering information during the course of this webinar. Looking at the situations in Myanmar, in parts of Africa and in Afghanistan is certainly extremely distressing. So much so that it seems overwhelming. It's even more overwhelming when we look at the global data that most of us involved in this webinar would know. The fact that there are over 80 million persons forcibly displaced across international borders, and that almost half of those are children. Perhaps there's less recognition of the fact that only a quarter or fewer than a quarter of those are under the care of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The vast majority of them have to fend for themselves in one way or another. So the global refugee and asylum seeker issue is one that confronts us as an international community, not just as individual nation states. The vast majority of these forcibly displaced persons, those who are being recognised as refugees, comes from a very small number of countries. And we've heard about most of those today. Afghanistan, Myanmar, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Added to those now must be those who have fled from Ukraine as a result of the aggressive Soviet-Russian invasion of Ukraine in recent weeks. That was a slip of the tongue, but perhaps not really, because the actions of the current Russian leadership are so reminiscent of the actions of the former Soviet leadership. Under these circumstances, it becomes increasingly difficult for refugees and asylum seekers and those who are simply fleeing violence, war, and persecution to obtain protection. It almost seems at times that the nations of the world are taking a free market approach to the protection of people, that we have competition now for who can be protected and who not. In many respects, international responses are being driven by specific national contexts. So, taking any individual country, there will be many factors that come into play in deciding to whom to offer protection and whom to reject. First and foremost is proximity. The closer a country that is having difficulties and generating refugee flows is to the country of asylum, the more of necessity that country is offering protection. It's simply a factor of the fact that people flee across borders, and when they flee to a neighbouring country, there's not much that anybody can do. So we can certainly congratulate Bangladesh on its enormous generosity in accepting the Rohingya people, a generosity that is fraying over time and that is seeing Rohingya subjected to more and more difficult circumstances. But in many respects, Bangladesh had no choice. The people were fleeing across the border and no one else was willing to take them. So proximity is certainly a critical factor. Another is historical connections. In the past, we have seen that peoples that are historically connected in some way, particularly in relation to conflict, have seen generous responses. So I recall from Australia's perspective, the response to people after the Indochina War ended in 1975, and the sense that Australia had some responsibility from those who were fleeing the consequences of that war. A third factor is identification across the country groups. Identification can involve common language, or at least similar language bases, common religion, a shared history, and unfortunately, similar race or ethnic backgrounds. I contrast here the responses that we are seeing in Eastern Europe to the 2015 refugee flow from Syria and the current one coming from Ukraine. Although in 2015, some 1 million refugees were accepted into Europe, most of them were accepted by Germany and Sweden and other countries in Western Europe, and few were accepted by Eastern Europe. Now we are seeing an enormous willingness to accept people from Ukraine in Eastern Europe. And that can only be because of proximity, of the historical connections, but also a sense of identification between the peoples of Eastern Europe and the people of Ukraine. Identification based on language type, religion, history, and regrettably, race and ethnicity. In all of these factors, the one that I haven't mentioned is the view of those who are seeking asylum. Too frequently, as Hafsah has mentioned, they are denied participation in decisions about their future. They are so desperate that they will take any kind of protection that is offered to them, wherever it may be, and are expected to be grateful for it. And yet, the wishes and the aspirations of those who are seeking protection are critical factors in how they will adjust to life outside their country of origin. When we look at Australia's international diplomacy on these issues, we have to acknowledge a very dismal situation. Australia is deeply compromised by our treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. And so in terms of international diplomacy, we are not trusted and we have very little influence. I can remember a time only 10 or 15 years ago when I would be asked by many of my international colleagues what on earth was happening in Australia in relation to refugees and asylum seekers. We had a reputation for being generous, for being open and being committed. And we completely demolished that refugee reputation during the early part of the 2000s, so that now we can say we are no longer trusted and we have no influence. Australia is not accepting many refugees and asylum seekers, no matter what the national leaders tell us, and no matter what the picture of ourselves we have built in recent years. Some work done recently, a few years ago, by the Refugee Council of Australia, put that into fairly stark proportions. Overall, we were 14th in the absolute number of refugees and asylum seekers that we accepted. But on a per capita basis, we were 20th. And relative to our GDP, our wealth, we were 60th. Any sense that we might have had that Australia was a generous country and was one of the best performers is simply not true, or at least it's not true anymore. Our policies towards those who apply onshore for asylum are internationally notorious. We have hard hearts. We're not prepared to admit that very often, but we have hard hearts. And that is undermining any credibility we have in international diplomacy, in arguing for more generous and more global solutions to refugee problems. We also show inconsistency in the way in which we deal with refugee flows. I mentioned before that proximity is a major factor in the willingness of countries to accept refugees and asylum seekers. For Australia, we seem to have turned this factor on its head The further away a country is, the more principled we are in our response. The closer a country is, the more compromised we are, the more unwilling we are to assist. I contrast at the moment Australia's response to the Ukraine crisis with how we have responded over the last year to the crisis in Myanmar. Australia responded immediately with the imposition of sanctions, both on Soviet, I said it again, Russian companies and the Russian leadership. And I can say that we are standing strongly with our Western allies on this. But so far as Myanmar is concerned, the exact opposite is the case. Since the coup began on the 1st of February last year, so now more than 13 months ago, Australia has not sanctioned a single Myanmar military leader or a single Myanmar business associated with the military. We have done virtually nothing about Myanmar, even though it's a closer neighbour by far, much more subjected to influence by Australia, and part of our broad area of concern in the Indo-Pacific region. Australia was once a leader in dealing with refugees and asylum seekers and leading solutions. We were one of the drivers of the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese refugees in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Our numbers of intake were amongst the best in the world. We had a concern about solving refugee problems before they arose by addressing conflict, seeking to prevent it or to resolve it after it had occurred. These factors that worked in our favour in the past are no longer true. If we are to restore our credibility and so restore our influence, there are a number of steps that we can take if we have the political will. Certainly, we have to increase our intake of refugees. That is especially the case in this region, and especially where we have responsibilities. Unfortunately, the government has been assisted by the tendency of the media and therefore public attention to move on. There was a lot of attention to Myanmar in February last year, but then that was overtaken by what was happening in Ethiopia and Tigray. Then we had the crisis in Afghanistan. Now we have Ukraine. There is no application to resolving problems, but rather there's a capitalisation on the shift in public attention that means that we can pass on without resolving anything. Second, we need to fix our domestic problems. We have had no boat arrivals in this country now for almost 10 years. And yet we still have numbers of people, small numbers, who are suffering enormously as a result of those policies. There are still 105 people trapped in Papua New Guinea as a result of Australia's policies. 112 trapped on Nauru. There are almost 2,000 who were brought to Australia from Nauru and Papua New Guinea who are living life in some form of limbo. There are still 2,500 waiting almost 10 years to have their applications resolved. And there are those on temporary protection visas who can never be sent home, but are being subjected to insecurity on a daily basis. The numbers are not great. And yet we don't even see this as a problem, let alone act to resolve it. We need to see a greater commitment to preventing conflict and resolving conflicts when they arrive, so that people are no longer forced to leave their countries of origin and seek protection elsewhere. That requires us to be far more consistent in our human rights diplomacy. Refugees are forced to leave their country when human rights break down and they are subjected to persecution and violence. It's as simple as that. And so if we are to prevent violence, prevent conflict and prevent refugee flows, we need to address underlying human rights issues. We have an election coming up in this country. I would like to think that these could be central issues for discussion during the course of the election, but they won't be. They won't be because issues about refugees and asylum seekers are toxic political issues in this country. These people who are in need of our protection have been weaponised for political purposes, particularly by the Conservative parties in Australia. So much so that the opposition party, the Labor Party, has no courage, no bravery, and no willingness to address the issues. I can't see anything good happening before the elections, but there will be an opportunity afterwards, whoever is elected, to try to resolve these problems that have long afflicted us in Australia, that are undermining our sense of ourselves and our sense of decency as a nation. We need, as community organisations, to be prepared to move after the elections, to seek to have these problems identified and addressed in the short opportunity we will have to do so. Thanks, Jasmina.
Having some problem with my Wi-Fi. Thank you, Chris. And thank you for highlighting the fact that our refugee and humanitarian program has actually been the lowest it's been in 45 years in 2021, just under 6,000 people. So that's extremely concerning. There were places that we've lost through the overall reductions to our program, and then places that were lost during COVID and due to COVID and were not rolled over in the next year. So now we'll start with some questions. There were a couple of questions that were answered, and I'm not sure if you've seen them, but I think they're quite important to respond to. So there was a question about reference by the Prime Minister to Ukrainians being on top of the pile, and the response by Refugee Council staff is here. It said that that was basically in reference to the outstanding visa applications that people from Ukraine already had in process with Home Affairs, which is approximately 465. This was for all kinds of different visas, so students, skilled family, when similar declarations the government actually made was in relation to people in Afghanistan, though there are many more visas in processing. And there was another question, which hopefully you have seen, and that was by Oliver, where he has asked about crisis in Ukraine and what will happen if people apply for temporary visas and then attempt to apply for permanent protection visas in Australia. The response was at this stage, it looks like they would follow the established process that exists, and it could take from 2 years up. So now the questions that I have, some of them are specific. So the first question was to Hafsah, and it was by Atem, and I think it's a question that all of you could say something about. It's how would a shared responsibility or responsibility sharing look like? What would it be? So Hafsah, have you got any thoughts about that?
Thank you. I'll try to answer with the best of my ability.
It's a complex question.
I forgot to mention at the very big during my presentation. I've experienced statelessness, and I am a former asylum seeker, a former Rohingya refugees, and now just be here in this country for 3 years and being in this mass refugee crisis. I don't know where to start, but then it makes me very passionate and restless human to be in this space. So to me, responsibility sharing is us connecting, because us as the individual, as somebody who wear different head under different organization, under different platform, we have different capacity, knowledge, and information and resources. So to me, responsibility sharing is if there is one particular area that we want to advocate, that we want to raise or address, us connecting, engaging, and sharing the resources, expertise, and knowledge that includes refugees and people with lived experience. And it's begin from the motivation that we have, and then driven by the passion and putting it in work. And I think it is possible to do that. So there have been many, the previous speaker has also mentioned about, there has been a lot of, in my perspective and in my view, I think it's a lot of exclusion and ignorance towards some refugee groups, like for some countries, like no refugees from this particular group to our country, like that. So that something that we can address. And also somebody has mentioned in the question and Q&A session about Afghan refugees and Rohingya refugees, Sri Lankan refugees are not welcome to some countries such and such and so and so. So I think it is time for us to actually look at inclusive approach and also responsibility sharing in a way that we can come together for advocacy for the particular payment area, whether it's be durable solution, whether it's be resettlement option, it's be advocating for the rights of refugee in the host country, we can come together. So from my message to all of you here on the call, if you see and think with my limited capacity and knowledge, Hafsah, I think we can do something together. Please reach out to me. It doesn't have to be for Rohingyas, as long as it is for any refugees. You know, I'm in. I hope I answer your questions.
Thank you, Hafsah. I mean, it is a complex question, and Chris kind of mentioned, sort of touched the question as well. So I'm not sure, Chris, would you like to comment on that as well?
Thanks, Yasmina. The comment I would make is that this kind of co-responsibility is essential for resolution of these issues, and it needs to be between states, but also between communities. But since I was asked to talk about diplomatic efforts, let me deal with the states. We have seen situations in the past, and I instance the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese Refugees. The states got together, there was temporary protection offered in a number of countries and final settlements in many other countries, including Australia. We took a significant number of Indo-Chinese refugees, and they have made an enormous contribution to this country. Let's not forget that. You know, so much of refugee discussion is on the basis that we're doing them a favour, whereas in the longer term, they do us a favour. And we should say, thank you for coming here. Thank you for casting in your lot with us. And we see how the Indo-Chinese refugees have assisted this country so much. So it's that kind of co-responsibility where receiving states can work together for processing and acceptance and allocating numbers, particularly giving a priority to the reunification of families, but bringing them in and getting the cooperation of transit states in that. Now, Australia tried something more recently, the Bali process, but there is no evidence of that going anywhere. And to me, a large part of the problem is because Australia sees the Bali process as a way of keeping people out and not a way of managing them coming in. And until we show some willingness to do that, we are not going to see anything comparable to the Indo-Chinese Plan of Action. We are just going to see talking taking place and the situation continuing to get worse. We really do need to see a major commitment by developed countries, including Australia, towards developing countries where most of these refugees originate, to resolving problems in the first place, but dealing with situations when they arise. And we don't see that at the moment.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I've got one for Adama now. The question is, how is Tigray's humanitarian blockage and siege for 16 months, how can it be compared with other crises in the world? And the response from international community, not just Australia, but the whole of international community. Could you comment on that, Adama?
Oh, very difficult questions to answer, but I think in terms of the Tigray situation, there is, I mean, as I mentioned before, there is that media blockout. So it's actually quite difficult for people to know what's actually happening on the ground. You know, media, social media, internet, phones, all of that, there's a blockout. I think the other thing also is that there's reports of deliberate attempts, deliberate blocks of aid getting into the country. So this is by various sources have said that there is actually deliberate blockage by the government of aid and humanitarian assistance coming in. So that is something, that is another thing that's unique. And I think that what is being called for is for Australia to use diplomacy and aid to be able to provide assistance to in response to the humanitarian need, but also look at you know, how the humanitarian program can assist, and also looking at, you know, people here on student visas similar to other countries or other communities extending those student visas whilst the conflict is happening. So yeah, I think there's some of the features there. I think also it is in a region where there is, as I mentioned before, conflicts happening. So people moving from one country to another, they're moving into really political instability in the region, and that adds to the need for more to be done through diplomacy and aid to see if there can be stability in the region.
Thank you, Adama.
Yeah.
I've got one for Shuja, and that's some comment on sanctions, but I think that would apply to Myanmar as well. Australia has been quick to apply sanctions to various entities from Russia, clearly, and we do have legislation to do so now, the Magnitsky legislation. Are there any sanctions that Australia could apply to Taliban that would make Afghanistan safer and improve the situation?
Well, thank you for whoever asked that question. There already are a raft of sanctions that are applied on the Taliban, not just because not just U.S. sanctions, but also UN Security Council sanctions on the Taliban. The effect of those sanctions has been that because the Taliban are now the de facto authorities in the country, those sanctions by extension have also been applied to the Afghan central bank, to Afghan ministries, but also to a lesser degree to the private sector because of the Taliban being in power. And so when we talk about what is wrong with Afghanistan, I think part of that is because the Taliban are in power, is what's wrong. Additional sanctions is unclear at the moment as to whether they will work, because the zeitgeist is to tailor and to tinker and to tweak the existing sanctions to reduce their impact on the Afghan economy while still maintaining the bite of the sanctions, if you will, on the Taliban. The Taliban have always operated in the shadows of the economy. They've always operated underground. So unlike what you would call the Russian oligarchs who have yachts in Italy and have bank accounts in Switzerland, the Taliban do not operate in that way. And so traditional sanctions have very little impact on the Taliban. But what impact the sanctions do have, and this is real, genuine impact, is that it continues to cast the Taliban as an element of undesirable presence in their current form with their current policy. And so sanctions have a tremendous signaling value to the Taliban because they've always wanted to come out of the shadows and be mainstream. They received some mainstreaming over the past 2 to 2.5 years, thanks to American diplomacy, thanks to also the diplomacy of other nations who met them, but also invited them over to their countries for these VIP trips. But there's one last final frontier that the Taliban want to cross in their attempts to become mainstream, and that is for all of the remaining US, UN, EU sanctions and the implementation of the above mentioned sanctions by countries like Australia on the Taliban. So keeping what is existing, the existing sanctions in place is an important signaling value to the Taliban that their behavior is undesirable, while tinkering the regime to reduce the effect of those sanctions on the Afghan economy is really the policy question of the moment with respect to Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. Another complex question, and thank you for explaining the sanctions that already exist. There's a question here for Chris, and I think it kind of ties in with the question about sanctions, because there are no sanctions when it comes to Myanmar. And I know that Human Rights Watch has been pushing for sanctions for a number of individuals and entities. So Chris, you could comment on sanctions, but also the question is, what are some of the ways Australia could be motivated to use human rights and duty-based approach to express its past generosity, and what role can civil society organizations and general public play?
Well, first on the sanctions question, no, there are no new sanctions on Myanmar. Australia did impose some sanctions in 2017, 2018, after the so-called clearance operation against the Rohingya. Those sanctions did not affect the top military leadership. It affected some people on the second rungs, and they did not apply and still do not apply to any military businesses. Since the start of the coup on 1st of February last year, Australia has not imposed a single additional sanction on Myanmar. We continue to exclude the senior general who was in charge of the brutality and his deputy, members of the so-called State Administrative Council, and others who were involved in the illegal junta. So our performance is absolutely appalling. And I do contrast it with the comprehensive sanctions we've opposed in respect of Ukraine. On Myanmar, we have not followed the United States or the EU or Canada or the UK. New Zealand has more comprehensive sanctions than we do. So it's absolutely ridiculous and totally unacceptable.
And what can civil society do?
And it's connected with the next question of motivate.
Yes.
I said before, and I say again, regrettably, it will not be possible to effect some shifts in policy during the course of the election campaign. In fact, I would go further and say the way in which Australian politics has become so toxic in relation to asylum seekers, even raising the subject during the course of the election campaign is likely to cause harm to asylum seekers who are here and those who we should be accepting. So regrettably, we have to sit back and wait. But there will be an opportunity for this year, after the elections, before the cycle clicks on too fast, to try to do something about it. And this is where civil society organisations and individuals need to be ready and willing and able to intervene. Part of the problem is even convincing Australian politicians that we have a problem. You know, I would have thought that the last 2 years, when we had closed borders and virtually no immigration, was the time to fix things for people who are already in this country. We're talking about a relatively handful of people. And yet the reason why these problems weren't fixed is simply because the politicians don't see it as a problem, and neither do the responsible bureaucrats. So we need to make it a problem for them. We need to let them know that it's long past time for these issues to be fixed. Fix them domestically, and then be willing to take a more credible, a more trusted response, initiatives internationally. It's about time that we restored our good name as a country by taking on these issues in a responsible way.
Thank you, Chris. That's good advice and suggestions for action. Shuja just wanted to give a quick comment on sanctions. Because
Yes.
quite a lot of questions, so let's see how we go.
Thank you, Yasmina, and thank you, Gabby, for asking the sanctions question. It completely escaped my mind to add that as the Taliban continue to remain in power and monopolize the instruments of state, they also are slowly emerging from the shadows and starting to use bank accounts, starting to buy property, and starting to own things. They already have property and have significant wealth in Pakistan, but sometimes technically those properties have been difficult to trace them to Taliban leadership, even though often it is common knowledge that they are owned by the Taliban. So the more they come out of the shadows, and the more the world learns of their undesirable behavior, the persecution of minorities, restrictions on women, and other forms of misbehavior, the more important it becomes for countries like Australia to actually use sanctions, not just as a signaling device to signal displeasure, but also as a means of pressure on the Taliban to induce them to change behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you stay on? A quick question from Atem Behed. Where does Taliban get their support? Who is affected by micro displacement? And what can UNHCR do to improve their data collection methods? And we have way more questions than we have time. But see, you're here.
Yeah, I think a representative of UNHCR is probably better placed to discuss the challenges that they faced since August of 2021. But I think one of the big things is for them to sort of recreate their presence along the key border crossing points that they were not able to, or that they were displaced from during the violence, because in the last months of the Afghan Republic, there was significant instability and violence on the border crossing points, especially in the West and also in the South and the East, where UNHCR had some presence. So that would be one way to discuss that, but I will leave that to UNHCR to discuss. The Taliban have some support under some segments of the population. Some of it's driven by parochial concerns, such as local level tribal and clan loyalties. Others are more opportunistic. Others are based on grievances against the West, the government, and others. But also some of it is the fuel that I think really ignites all of it is the radicalization of these people in the madrasas in Pakistan, where they've been exposed to a radical curriculum of that fuels their ideology into in Afghanistan, because marginalization and dispossession is often essential, but not sufficient conditions for creating a movement like the Taliban. Ideology and indoctrination often have to be added to it to ignite that. But also their military capability over many, many decades has actually been empowered, enabled, and magnified by their ability to slip across the southern border into Pakistan, where they can regroup, receive health and medical attention for their fighters, raise funds, raise men, and come over. And that has proven to be a source of their resilience in these parts. That's obviously a very reductive way of talking about the many complex ways that the Taliban are operating and the sources of their support. But I think I'm happy to continue this conversation on a different format. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamal. And I think there are a number of comments, number of questions which really relate to the Home Affairs processes. And I think as Refugee Council, we should take note of those and ensure they are they're included in our conversations with the government. So there was also a question, but on 23 minutes, okay, 1:23. Which countries in the OECD should Australia be emulating in accepting and resettling refugees? And what are they doing well that we could learn from? Adama, would you like to comment on that? Any countries that we should be learning from, and what should we learn? What is it?
I think that there are a number of countries. I mean, looking at the intake in countries like USA and Canada, which is significantly greater than what Australia is currently offering. You know, I think in the last year, the USA's intake was significant. I can't recall the exact number from the top of my head, but it's significant. I mean, of course, America has a greater population, but their response to the crisis is greater than what Australia has. And I think what we need Australia to be doing is actually to have a consistent approach, and an increased humanitarian program allows us to be able to do that. With a small number such as 13,750, what happens is that we end up putting refugee communities against each other. You know, as crisis occurs in different parts of the world and the focus changes, you know, there's that concern that, okay, well, there's a new crisis, so therefore we're not going to be included in the intake. And of course, you know, an increased program allows for us to have a greater response and a more consistent response to what's happening. But it also means that Australia can also use, you know, be more strategic in how it responds to crises, looking at what other countries are doing. If there's particular conflicts, so there's other countries, a greater response to Australia, can also look at other areas that need humanitarian aid to say, okay, what is our response in this situation? And looking at, I think there's some questions have come up around family reunion as well. I think looking at how we can be responding to family reunion in addition to our intake. So I think there's a couple of different ways Australia can respond, but looking at what other countries are doing so that we can actually plan our response as well. We can increase the intake to allow us to be more responsive as new crises emerge, and then looking at you know, options like the Community Refugee Sponsorship Program and a family reunion program. I mean, for many years, RCOA has been calling for a separate family reunion program to be able to allow us to respond to the needs and connect separated family members. So yeah, there are a couple of options. And again, I think it's ongoing advocacy. We'll be able to, we can continue to advocate for some of these changes.
Great, thank you, Adama. And that sort of leads us to what we can do in terms of actions. And Atem has asked basically about strategy. What do we do about the situation of people seeking asylum in Australia when there's a general election coming, and this being a time to say something? there was a reply here. We'd like to encourage everyone to take action in terms of calling on your MP. And candidates, both parties or both sides or all sides in your electorate to encourage Australia to step up and restore the humanitarian program. The Adem's question was around the strategy in regards to asylum seekers. So that's another conversation that needs to be had, but we are coming close to the end and we would like to encourage you to take action. We'd like you to take something away from here. First, we'd like to hear from you about your opinion on the survey. So we'll be putting a feedback survey link, which only takes 2 minutes, in the chat. So we'll really appreciate your feedback. So the chat is happening. And in terms of action, we need your help to write to your MP and write to all the candidates. And what we want you to ask is an increase to 20,000 per annum for people from all different countries so that we can address the crisis that continues to unfold in Ukraine, but also Afghanistan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Democratic Republic of Congo. So we need to go back to the 2013 level of 20,000 places. You can tell your member of parliament or a candidate that we have actually lost about 28,000 places that were previously budgeted for. So they were the places that we've lost through COVID, but also through the general cuts to the refugee and humanitarian program. We have provided some text that you can use, but of course the advice that we have been given by former politicians is that letters are important, letters work, and they're best if you can actually make them personal and include your own comments or your own thoughts. You can use the text again. We have provided amended, send it from your email, and hopefully you'll get a response. You can use the information to request a meeting with your local member of parliament and see if he'll talk to you. And we can continue that as an ongoing campaign. We'll share all this information with our membership, with our base and supporters, and ask them to write letters. And then once you've done that, can you tweet and promote the action amongst your family and friends? So share far and wide. We'll also post that in chat. It might be in chat already. You'll also find it on our Twitter page. The draft letter is available in the Humanities virtual hub. So we'll also send you an email about that. So there's many different ways you can get the text. Now, feedback for the webinar is in the chat. And also the action, link to the action information. But the basis of the action is we want the refugee and humanitarian places back at least 20,000, which was the 2013. And we want that to happen in the new budget would be excellent, but the sooner the better, because the situation is as it is. And we want you to share that with everyone. There was only another comment. I think, Hannah, we might need to get back to you because there's some really specific questions about processes, and that's a conversation we might need to have. So I think that's it for now. Hoping you have managed to access the feedback link and the link to the letter. There you go. Thank you everyone for attending. We're going to hold more of these webinars in the future.